Hi historians, and welcome to the lesson on the purges. We are looking, now that we have this idea of Stalin's economic policies within Russia and the period of collectivization and urbanization, we're now starting to think about his method of control and how he kept power at this point in time. And the purges, or the Great Terror as it's sometimes known, is the way forward for this. So in terms of your learning intention, we're looking to explore the purges and terror in more detail, and a couple of success criteria points. You need to be able to define what the purges actually were. Think about how Stalin basically used it to wipe out his enemies, and this element of control over Russia that he used this as an excuse for. And then we're also thinking about how the purges not only impacted on the party and the political side of things, but also on the ordinary Russian people. So we've got the economic side of things as well, but also the social side. In terms of reading assignment, you are page 249 to 275 from the Corn and Fine textbook. If you have not got a physical copy of it, but you need one or you want one, you are free to come and pick it up from reception. I will leave some there if you want, just let me know, or you can use the digital version which is in the team. So in your notes, make a heading somewhere, make sure you've got this linked in, and then we will move on. So, overview wise for this part of the topic, obviously at the point that we were looking at previously, the 5-year plans had been going, industrialisation was obviously the focus, and at the end of the first 5 years there is a lot of announcements that they have not only met the targets but met them early, and that's great, but there was an awful lot of hostility, especially towards the kind of communist government for inflicting this whole policy upon them, and concerns within the party were really starting to come about really how fast this kind of industrialisation seemed to be taking place. There was a lot of concern that it wasn't actually sustainable. There's a growing number of signs of opposition then to Stalin as a result of this and the collectivization period, and there was really a very real possibility that he would be replaced as leader. Then they have some kind of uprising points where it's not a full kind of scale revolution, but there are some people starting to speak out openly against Stalin, which he reacts to quite aggressively, which we'll have a look at in a moment. And then in December 1934, a leading member of the Politburo was murdered, Sergei Kirov. Now, this triggered what we refer to as the wave of purges and the wave of the Great Terror. Ultimately, it reached its peak in 1937, where most of what we're going to be talking about occurred, and then just into the kind of 1938 period. Thousands of members of the Communist Party were accused of being involved in various conspiracies against Stalin and the party leadership, and they were taken care of as a result. They were either arrested and imprisoned or they were executed. The terror also engulfs other areas of society, so we've got the sort of social areas, massive sections of the populations, everyday lives being affected, but also a lot of emphasis being put on trustworthy people within the military. So there are massive purges within the armed forces that are going to become quite a serious problem later on as a result of this impending war that we obviously know will happen. General historians tend to disagree about what the causes of the purges in the terror period actually were. A lot of people will emphasise this idea that Stalin's personality was responsible for them, and this links into this idea of him being a very paranoid individual who undertook this particular action in an effort to get rid of what he saw as enemies everywhere. And there is an element of that, but quite often other historians will see this as an element of control. The purges were pretty much just an excuse for Stalin to show that he could not and would not be messed with, and he used it to control not only the party but also to almost cement his position as party leader and overall ruler of Russia at this point in time. So, thinking about opposition to Stalin then, before we talk about the purges at any great length, we want to kind of have this foundation about what opposition actually had developed before 1934 kicked off. So you're going to use section B, which is page 252 to 253, and there's a focus group task there that I want you to do, using the information in the headings to help you. I also want you to keep in mind this idea of personality and think about whether or not a personal event like the suicide of Stalin's wife, for example, plays an important role in deciding the future history of a country. So is it a case of up to a certain point what Stalin was doing was in reaction to opposition and control, but then from that point it becomes more personal? See what you can kind of think of with that in mind as you're working through this and the rest of the PowerPoint, because this is going to help you decide which of the schools of history you also agree with. So pause the video roughly about this point and we can come back to this in a little bit more detail. So obviously now that we have a bit of more of an understanding about what kind of opposition Stalin faced in 1934 and up to that point, we can kind of see how this development of the Great Purges actually transpired during the next couple of years. So when we refer to the Purges period, we do include some of the 1934 elements, but we're really meaning just this sort of 3-year period between 1936 and 1939, with the majority of what we're talking about taking place in the 1937 kind of period. Stalin's kind of reaction to this is that he was trying to get rid of whatever was impure or undesirable, and this could be in terms of classes within society, about privatisation and capitalism within Russia itself, organised religion, things like that. The purges had a couple of stages to them. So there was the purges of the party, which we're going to look at in a wee bit more detail, the purges of the armed services, and then the purges of the people. And those kind of 3 elements, according to Michael Lynch at least, are what Stalin was kind of going on. During this period, millions of people were arrested, executed and sent to the gulags, or the labour camps as we know them as. He used the NKVD, which were the secret police force, to undertake this, and generally ended up purging about 90% of the army's top officers, every admiral in the navy, about 1 million Communist Party members, and roughly about 20 million just ordinary Russian people. Now, at the same time as the purges are going on, it's not always about the force, and it's not just kind of the force element that he's trying to do here. He's also encouraging a kind of carrot and stick thing with the cult of personality. Lots of propaganda was being used to make people aware of how important Stalin actually was in every single aspect of their life, from their work to their home lives as well as their leisure time. And this propaganda was also important to how effective the purges and this period of terror actually was. Now, if we take it from the aspect of Stalin trying to keep control, it is really clear that both of these things are needed. He needs to use the propaganda element, but he also needs the kind of force between those two sides of things to try and make his control be complete. We're going to talk about the cult of personality a little bit in more detail in the next lesson, so we're focusing on the purges in this lesson, but it is worthwhile keeping that in mind just as we go on. So ultimately, how were they carried out? We're going to talk about the purges themselves in a minute or two, and then we're going to move on to think about the show trials, the imprisonment of people, and the executions. These 3 elements are really what the purges were and how they kept people in line. Now, as we've kind of been going so far, you may have noticed that I have been using the term purges and terror both to refer to what we're talking about. Both of these terms, aka the Great Terror or the Great Purges, are used to refer to this kind of period between 1936, end of 36, 1937 and 1938 to the beginning of 1939. Sheila Fitzpatrick, one of my favourite historians, in her book, she refers to the term Great Purges as a Western term, not a Soviet one. She argues that when we talk about the purges, we're talking about it from a Western historical viewpoint, because in Russia there was no public way to refer to it at the time, and simply in private it was referred to as 1937 because that is what it was. Other historians, such as Robert Conquest, amongst others, they call the period the Great Terror. A lot of more recent research has kind of shifted the emphasis away from this idea of it just being a purge, which kind of makes you think it's only about the political aspect and maybe the military aspect, and instead use terror because it includes this more umbrella-like term for what was happening. Therefore, the purges are a right term to use, they are a correct term, but they are a part of this kind of wider Great Terror umbrella, which Robert Conquest argues was a more accurate way of explaining the party victims and the non-party and the non-communist victims who were also targeted at this point in time. So if you're looking through other pieces of reading and other materials, you might refer to this as the Great Terror more often because it is more likely to be seen in more modern texts, but the two things are referring to kind of the same period in time. So the use of terror had been a feature of collectivization and the rapid industrialization process that we have already talked about, this kind of class warfare and things like that being used. For example, the measures against the kulaks and people being deported to Siberia or to the labour camps by the end of collectivization if they were not meeting targets or were to be openly against the whole policy of it there. You have, again, back to the kulaks, the more enterprising peasants being shot or deported, and the death sentence for peasants who are caught hoarding grain or stealing socialised property, as it was referred to. So terror was not necessarily just linked into the purges, it was more for everyone, which is why we use that terminology. And you can see how the last two lessons that we've looked at with collectivization and the 5-year plans and industrialization kind of link into this. Officials and managers at the time were really too afraid of being accused of sabotaging plans for industrialization during the 5-year plans or criticising the party. So during this industrialization period, they tended not to speak out about problems. Back with the collectivization element, Stalin is using this idea of the class enemies to kind of get people on side, and he finds that this is working really effectively, so he starts to use the same idea for the industrialized areas as well. Class enemies. So bourgeoisie specialists become the targets for the industrialization areas. These are any kind of old pre-1917 managers, engineers, the technical staff, the people basically who had survived the revolution because they had the technical knowledge and industrial expertise that were needed to keep the economy going. All of a sudden they turn from being kind of key elements and key workers in this whole society to being the new class that are being targeted, the bourgeoisie specialist. They get labelled as saboteurs, who are apparently deliberately causing breakages and hold-ups as a way to kind of explain why the industrialisation had not met its plans as effectively as Stalin was claiming that they had. They were used as a cover-up for the failings of this industrialisation process. And this is kind of where we can see the terror starting to come in a little bit more detailed. Examples were made of certain factories and certain areas like the Shakti coal mine. You can see more information about this on page 228 in the textbook. We've got confessions and show trials being used, prison sentences and executions and things like that. Gosplan, the Central Planning Committee, were purged of anyone who was referred to as a pessimist, so anybody who claimed that this couldn't or wouldn't possibly work, or any non-party members by the end of the 1920s. The early 1930s, we can then see trials of these specialists and professionals starting to happen, and executions or gulags, sentences being put for them. By November 1930, we've got the Industrial Party show trial, which had been invented by Stalin, and then you've got the Metro Vickers trials for the rest of them in 1933 as well. So prior to 1934, we can kind of see this growing opposition and how Stalin was dealing with it quite effectively. Now, when we talk about the purges in general, we tend to only talk about these as if Stalin was the one that had created and invented them. But actually, these actions that he was taking against opposition were the same actions that Lenin had taken before him. So really, he is showing himself to be a bit of a disciple of Lenin by continuing them. So Lenin had used class warfare for the peasants and for the people back in the cities. He had used the Cheka, the secret police, to enforce these views and to try and get rid of anyone who was talking out against the Bolshevik Party, and then the Communist Party as it became. He used the period of Red Terror, which we've looked at as well. During the NEP, there was show trials of the so-called NEP men. We've got the ban of factionalism in 1921 and the exile of the intellectuals in 1922. So these things are kind of similar to what Stalin is going to do later on. Also, the reason for this, as far as Lenin and the party earlier are concerned, is because of how they are actually recruiting. So it becomes necessary to actually get rid of some of their more modern or newer recruits, because they are the ones that tend to join when the lower entry standards are in place, and this tends to be during periods of crisis. So anytime that the entry standards are lowered, like during the Civil War, for example, or during collectivisation, the amount of party members needs to be consistent. To do this, they will lower the entry standards to allow people to come in so that the numbers stay high, and then after the crisis is over, target those particular members and get rid of them, unless they can prove themselves useful. So the purges and terror that Lenin developed obviously continued after his death, because we've got Trotsky, Kamenev and Zinoviev being expelled from the party, Trotsky going into exile in 1929, and though Zinoviev and Kamenev were forgiven and allowed back in by Stalin, this is probably going to come back to bite them quite effectively during the purges and the trials era. Under Stalin, the purges were not new, they just intensified. The show trials were more common, and he took more of a ready part in them than Lenin maybe had done. And you've got the Yezhovshchina, which was the NKVD leader who took over at the high point of these, who more or less took it upon himself to personally ensure that the NKVD really made a big name for themselves, which meant that the level of terror definitely increased. Whether Stalin was aware of that or not, he would later go on to say that he wasn't, but he definitely made out that this was actually a result of the NKVD and their leadership, rather than something he was telling them to do. He just allowed them to continue doing it. So it definitely intensified for a number of reasons. Under Lenin, the purges tended to be non-violent purges of the party, where people were expelled from the party rather than arrested, whereas under Stalin, it was during collectivisation, they were extended. During the period of industrialisation, they were then extended again, and wide terror was used inside the party as well as outside to try and keep the people in control and to try and keep the party in line. So those are the two differences really between the purges under these two particular leaders. Stalin was not a man who shied away from death and from using terror and using force when he needed to. As we've said before a couple of times in class, he is well known for this particular quote: "One death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic," showing that realistically he was not unprepared to use force and to ultimately allow death and destruction to happen to his people and the population of the USSR to get where he thought he needed to go. Quite often when we talk about this, there is a lot of emphasising the idea that he had purposely created famine during collectivisation. He knew what collectivisation would do and he allowed it to happen. The same with the force and the elements of the industrialisation. And this is kind of where this quote comes from. So when we're thinking about how far his personality was behind the purges, this quote is one of the kind of key points of that argument. He was willing to make these these levels of sacrifice in order to get to the greater good, or to continue enforcing the communist revolutionary ideals that he thought were best for Russia. So, quick task then for you to do for your notes. We're thinking about what do we actually mean by the purges. You're going to go back to the textbook and use section A from our reading assignment, and you're going to build the table on the different types of purge that existed. So, table like this, where you've got a column for the type of purges, a little bit of an explanation about what they are, and then the differences and similarities between that particular type and the rest of them. So pause the video and fill this in, and then go back and continue the video. So realistically, when we think about what the causes of the purges actually were, the catalyst that encouraged Stalin to actually use them as a means of control and a means of eradicating his opposition. We have this event in 1932, Ryutin's challenge, where more or less it was an indication for Stalin that there were people who were involved in speaking out against him within the party, and that it was something he did have to watch out for. He said, and went on record as saying, that Stalin is the evil genius who had brought the revolution to the verge of destruction. And there were a few people in the party who agreed with him and who were ready to follow him. He was expelled and then later imprisoned in 1932, and then in 1937, at the height of the terror, he was executed as an enemy of the state. He'd been originally a former Moscow party secretary, again, not particularly high up in the party, but someone that did have a bit of sway with people that would listen to him. And he circulated amongst the Central Committee a document, 200-word document known as the Ryutin Platform. In it, he more or less denounces Stalin completely as this evil genius, criticising him for creating what he referred to as a personal dictatorship, and urging, very similarly to how Lenin had in the deathbed testament, that he should be removed from power and authority as quickly as possible. For this kind of denouncing of Stalin, he was arrested on the 23rd of September, tried and expelled from the party. Immediately Stalin wanted the death penalty and marked him as a traitor, but he was opposed by others in the Politburo and didn't actually manage to get that. What he did though, however, is used it as an opportunity to basically purge roughly about 1 million party members, which was a third of the members of the party, and accused him of being part of this kind of plot to overthrow him, and part of this kind of group. So this is the first occasion where we see Stalin starting to take control of the party and try to keep control of it by getting rid of people who were maybe not the top 3 competitors like Trotsky and Bukharin were, but definitely that there were lower members starting to talk against him, and that he was going to react very aggressively towards this. The next catalyst that we're really looking at is the murder of Sergei Kirov in 1934. Kirov had challenged industrialisation, or at least the speed that industrialisation was happening at, and had been murdered at this point in time. Now, the great purges of the party is often attributed to Kirov's murder, because that was the excuse that Stalin gave for actually taking out people within the party itself, that he was on a hunt for Kirov's murderer. So Kirov had been a secretary of the Leningrad Soviet. He had been elected to the Politburo at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, where he had actually received more votes than Stalin. He was a secretary of equal rank along with Stalin, and it kind of showed that he potentially had the ability to be more liked if he continued the way he was going. Spoke out against this continuing rapid industrialisation process, and especially against the forced grain requisitioning, where he argued that it was unnecessary because the fundamental difficulties that Russia had suffered were actually behind them at this point in time. He was murdered on the 1st of December 1934 by an assassin called Leonid Nikolaev, There are no real understanding and motives behind why Nikolaev would have actually done this, and there was a lot of discussion about whether or not it was actually him that was responsible, or whether he had been put up to it by someone else. Now today we now know that Stalin had actually hired him to kill Kirov, but at the time it was considered to be some sort of uprising from within the party that Stalin then needed to stamp out. This is Kirov here, you can see him at the bottom there. So, to try and kind of get your head around why the Kirov murder mystery in particular was such a kind of major catalyst for the purges, we're going to use section C of the textbook, and that's pages 254 to 257, and complete the two activity boxes that are there on page 254 and 256. So pause the video at this point and then go back and fill this bit in. So the consequences of these things. They were catalysts that allowed Stalin to act. After Kirov's murder, he passed what was referred to as the Decree Against Terrorist Acts, which pretty much allowed Stalin to purge the party. 3,000 suspected leftists and so-called Trotskyites were arrested, and others were executed under this terrorist act decree. Other people were removed from key positions and replaced with people who were very loyal Stalinist supporters, including Nikita Khrushchev, who, as we remember from Cold War topic at Higher, is actually a very important figure going forward. He would later become the party leader in Moscow. The Stalin enrollment then allowed thousands of new members to join, who were only allowed to join because they had been given Stalin's personal blessings, which meant that they owed their membership of the party, which was a really key point for some of them, to Stalin themselves. And because it was with Stalin himself, they were very loyal to him, not necessarily to the party itself. And this meant that he was definitely sure that these people would be on side if he needed them. Ultimately, Kirov's murder allowed for the removal of opponents. Stalin declared that the Soviet Union was under siege from enemies within, and he encouraged local parties to root out any sort of sympathisers and try to ensure that they would be publicly punished and humiliated for their part in this kind of upsurge of terrorist activity. The arrests at the time led to show trials, because obviously if you're going to make a spectacle out of this whole thing, you're going to want to ensure that as many people as possible can see it. And the Prosecutor General, who we can see named here, was actually encouraged by Stalin to try and make as much of a public display of the trials as he possibly could. So he aided and abetted with this, and quite often gave out the harshest punishments available to people that he had been instructed to give them out to. So by the spring of 1937, Stalin made it really clear that he thought that traitors and spies had infiltrated the party at all levels in every area of Russia. He encouraged the low-ranking party members to criticise and denounce those in higher positions, and ultimately, as you can imagine, this resulted in a flood of accusations. Party members were unmasked, as it were, by colleagues as enemies, and quite often they would then have to scramble to defend themselves. Easiest way to do that is to get attention from themselves by denouncing other people. They were usually, if they were accused, invited to confess before mass meetings of the party, and then they would be arrested. This flood turned into a torrent as more and more party members were dragged in and accused. Some denounced fellow members in order to get their jobs, so to move up, or to settle old scores or revenge kind of points that they needed to do. Others, again, like I said, it was to deflect criticism from themselves onto other people and make themselves safe. Now, the first bullet point here on this slide kind of gives the impression that it was very much in Stalin's mind. He thought traitors and spies had infiltrated the party at all levels. And within that, we can link this back to this idea that Stalin's paranoia and personality are the main reasons why the purges became so aggressive. However, by doing this way, it may have had some root within a personal paranoia, certainly, but we're not trained psychologists. We don't have the ability to decide whether or not someone was a paranoid, schizophrenic, or things like that. We don't have the right to diagnose him. We look at this principally on behaviour and how he acted and what the repercussions of this and the outcomes of these things would be. So by making it clear that he thought that there were genuine threats within the country, he was able to actually exert a very tight grip of control over the party members. No one would question who he was bringing in to take positions of authority or these memberships that he was allowing in that normally the party wouldn't allow, if they knew that they potentially could then be denounced as a result of this decree. So though it may seem like it was very much paranoid based, a lot of this is a political manoeuvre, a manipulation of the situation that on the outside for people looking in could be seen as terrorist activity because assassinations have happened, etc., but realistically was used purely to just cause distrust and terror within the party itself, to ensure that the only person that each member of the party thought that they had to keep on the good side of was Stalin. And if this was the case, he was totally convinced that anyone who would potentially be against him would be rooted out before they got to a point where they could actually act in a way that potentially removed him from power. So for a lot of historians looking at this, and for looking at it from that perspective, you could argue that this was a method of control rather than just about his personality. So when we think about the causes of the actual purges themselves, the control of the party and the population of Russia as a wider aspect is really key. It's about removing enemies, it's about stopping opposition to this rapid industrialisation which he needs to happen. Remember, he's convinced in the 30s that war's on the horizon, so this is a really important point for him. And it is also about removing what is referred to as anti-Soviet elements, trying to make sure that the ideology that Stalin has for Russia is the only ideology moving forward. So in order to do this, he now knows that the party is under this kind of banner of terror. They are completely within his grasp. He has to think about where opposition would come from as well. What are the other elements of society that are needed in order to maintain control over his leadership? And the answer to that is the military and the armed forces. If you think back all the way to 1905 and you think about why the 1905 revolution was not successful, it's because the armed forces were on Nicholas's side. So by ensuring that the armed forces were controlled along with the political situation, Stalin ensured that control of Russia kept within his grasp. So in 1937 he turns on the armed forces. He was convinced that he could not count on the army to follow his policies if he was forcing them to do something that they didn't want to do. The leaders of the army were tough and they were very difficult to intimidate, so the same level of terror he had used within the actual political party itself would not actually work within the army. He had to get a little bit tougher than this. One of the major generals was a hero of the Civil War, and it was quite clear that the people within the army were willing to follow him as a result of this. But during this period of time, he became quite disillusioned with Stalin's view of what Russia was going to be like. Collectivization and industrialization were not what he expected to see, and he came into contact with Stalin as a result of this. Ultimately, the conflict between the two men becomes quite apparent quite quickly, and Stalin claimed that the army were plotting to overthrow him. He claimed that the generals had met in secret to decide the best way to get rid of him, and as a result they were arrested. They had confessions beaten out of them, agreed that they were plotting to overthrow and assassinate Stalin, and they were executed as a result of this. The NKVD were then given free rein to work their way through the rest of the armed forces and take out potentially anybody that was in their way. Now, this meant that a large number of the armed forces were purged and taken out. The fact that Stalin would risk wiping out the people who were realistically the best commanders and the most experienced commanders when there was this prospect of war looming, which he was convinced was going to happen, is a very powerful indication of how far he was willing to actually go to maintain his control, and how far the level and depth of this terror actually had gone. There was definitely an increasing likelihood of world war at this point in time. All of the industrial resources within Russia had been directed towards getting it militarily ready, towards armaments, things like that, but Stalin was really, really unsure of the army's actual loyalty. 7 other generals were actually arrested, and half of the commissioned officers, which is roughly about 35,000, were either executed or in prison. He then went into the Soviet Navy and the Air Force and purged them as well, all serving admirals, and all but one senior Air Force commander was taken out and similarly either executed or imprisoned. So by 1939, when Hitler and Nazi Germany do then obviously come to war with the rest of Europe, the armed forces of Russia is severely weakened, quite seriously weakened in fact, to the extent that when we think about what happens next, which we will go into in more detail, it is no wonder that Germany did actually manage to invade and quite significantly damage Russia before they managed to actually fight back. The purge of the military did definitely leave them in a weakened state. So now, with political aspects under his control, along with the military aspects of Russia under his control as well, there is one other element that Stalin actually needs to ensure that he can stay in power and that his ideology is the way forward for the USSR. So this means that the purges and the terror has to be rolled out to take in the entire Russian population. Society itself needs to be the focus. They took in all areas of society and all institutions. Yezhov, head of the NKVD, drew up an arrest list of over 250,000 people, which included scientists, artists, writers, managers, anyone like that. Basically, anybody could be arrested as an oppositionist at this point in time. A quota system was applied by Yezhov and the NKVD to the geographical areas of Russia and to all of the public bodies, which they had to meet. So quite often it didn't matter whether or not you were an oppositionist or you had said something against Stalin, it just happened maybe that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they had to meet this quota of dissidents that they were trying to get hold of, and you just happened to be there. So they arrested you. In July of 1937, the proportion to be shot in one of these particular quotas was at 28%, with the rest of the people being sentenced to up to 10 years hard labour. So again, it is a very high number, and it is a very high likelihood that just anyone could actually be pulled in at any time. And this uncertainty about what it was that actually caused you to be arrested or caused you to end up with one of these sentences was a really key element in keeping control in Russia, just as it was in other places at this point in time in Europe or previous to this. For example, if you think back to National 5 history and the control of Nazi Germany by Hitler and the Nazi Party, it's a similar sort of ideal. A huge media campaign was also then started because, remember, more focus on carrot and stick. So you've got the stick element, but you also need to have the carrot. So huge media campaign where the general people are called the saviours of the revolution, and they're encouraged to criticise party officials, bureaucrats, other managers and things like that, to denounce workers and saboteurs within the workplace, generally pretty much ensure that every area of the population was covered by this widening terror. Once suspects had been arrested and then subjected to interrogation by the NKVD, they would also come up with the name of accomplices, and this could be workmates, friends, husbands, wives, sons, daughters. Anybody could find themselves being arrested purely because they had connections with someone who had been accused and had confessed. People were also arrested for criticising Stalin in general, or if you were a friend of someone who was arrested, or for telling a joke about Stalin, or generally being in the wrong place at the wrong time, like we said. Quite often these arrests were done purposely at night, so between 11 o'clock at night and 3 o'clock in the morning is when the arrests happened. The NKVD drove around in black vehicles, which were called Ravens, to collect their unwilling passengers, and it was always the Ravens that came for them. You would get a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and it was a well-known fact. It was almost like everyone in Russia knew someone who had been in a gulag, or had a relative or a neighbour or a friend who had been taken away by someone to go to these gulags, so people knew what was going to happen. This really inspired fear and terror and fear of the unknown in particular, because you never knew if someone was going to come to you and say that they had denounced you, or if someone that you knew or a family member had been arrested and they were going to target you next, purely because of your association with this person. As a result of this, a lot of people kept a packed bag ready just in case the knock was actually for them, so they could pick up their meagre belongings and take them with them. Arrests were then followed by the inevitable interrogation, and by that read torture, in which the victims were strongly urged to confess their opposition to Stalin and their involvement in counter-revolutionary groups. Now, confessions were really important. Without the confession, there was no legitimate reason for these arrests to actually take place, and there was no way to actually prove that the state, and therefore Stalin and his "we are under attack from within," was actually correct. So the confessions being the first thing that they did after the arrest was actually a logical strategy, because there was actually no real evidence that the accused was actually guilty at all, and quite often the evidence they did have was frankly laughable. It didn't stand up in a court of law, so they needed the confessions to legitimise the arrests. A lot of these Soviet citizens would die in prison, either being shot while trying to escape, in air quotes, or dying from torture, or being shot in just prison in general. There were so many of them that vans marked with big meat symbols regularly arrived at Moscow cemeteries to deliver the loads of naked bodies, which were then put into mass graves. If you didn't die, you were then sent to the Gulag, which was the network of labour camps across the USSR, where you were likely to die because of the conditions. Some of the most feared of the gulags were in the north, where the freezing weather, the hard work, the inadequate food and clothing pretty much made life completely intolerable, and many died as a result of their exposure to these areas. Ultimately, the effects of the terror and the purges. The old Bolshevik party members were eradicated. Stalin made sure that there was no semblance of the old Bolshevik party left that could potentially challenge him. Thousands of party members were denounced or killed. Professionals were subject to imprisonment or arrest. 3/5 of the marshals of the armed forces were arrested. The Orthodox Church was targeted, with priests being executed and arrested as well. Quotas were issued for the numbers of purges in each area, as we've seen. 1/18 of the overall population of Russia was arrested, which maybe doesn't seem like an awful lot, but considering how many people there were in Russia, that is a high number. And ultimately, by 1941, 8 million prisoners were being held in the Gulag system across Russia. So the effects of the terror were very devastating for certain aspects of Russia, and obviously very useful for Stalin to exert control. In terms of numbers, the estimates actually vary. There are gaps and inconsistencies in the evidence that we have access to, and if you have a look at page 226 of the Corn and Fine textbook, you can see a table there that kind of shows you what our rough estimates actually are for this. The aftermath of the purges was a vastly decreased population for Russia, a weakened administration and government, declining industrialisation rather than increasing, because he'd gotten rid of the people who were most experienced, a mass weakening and reduction of the armed forces, and generally a bit of chaos. When the Great Purges ended officially in 1939, Yezhov and the NKVD were blamed for the excesses of society being targeted, and that they had gotten a little bit too trigger happy with the powers that they'd been given. However, the purges didn't stop there. Stalin still continued them on, they just died down in terms of the intensity in 1939. So we've talked a little bit about the show trials that were actually used as an instrument of the purges, but not gone into them in any real detail, which is what we're going to do just now. Within a few weeks of Kirov's murder, there had obviously been this extensive purge of the Leningrad Party, which had been Kirov's power base, which we referred to. Thousands of people were arrested and executed, being accused of being Trotskyites, or involved in the plot to murder Kirov and other leading communists. Again, this element of terrorists from within the party itself. Zinoviev and Kamenev were arrested and they were put on trial in January of 1935. Although no direct evidence could actually be produced against them, they confessed, they were found guilty, and they were given prison sentences. It basically seemed that few of those close to Stalin were demanding an extension of the terror at this point. But Stalin found out about communication between Trotsky and members of oppositionist groups within the party. So he retaliated by sending out a Central Committee circular in June of 1936, where he discussed the terrorist activities of the Trotsky Revolutionary Counter Bloc, or the Counter-Revolutionary Bloc. In this circular, it contained some really crucial words. And in particular, the ones that we are really interested in is this phrase here, where he says, "The inalienable quality of every Bolshevik under present conditions should be the ability to recognise an enemy of the people, no matter how well he may be masked," which is a good indication really quite early in kind of June 1936 of what he was planning to do within the party and the purges that would then result from this. It was a sign basically that the old Bolsheviks were not safe, that they were going to be unmasked. It didn't matter about how long they'd been members, how loyal they'd been, their connection to Lenin or the party before this point. They were going to be unmasked if they were an enemy. Zinoviev and Kamenev were pulled out of prison, and in August 1936 they were put on trial in the full glare of the public eye. With them were also 14 others who had previously been members of the oppositionist groups within the party, who were pretty much just the known names of opposition to Stalin and his ideals. These show trials were very elaborately staged. The state prosecutor, as we've already talked about, proved the accused guilty of spying for foreign powers, being part of counter-revolutionary groups and blocs, being involved in Kirov's murder, and plotting to assassinate Stalin, and Stalin being the next victim of their mass assassination plot. The idea of the show trial was an effective way to create an atmosphere of intimidation, a sense of real danger, and the feeling that there were literally enemies and spies everywhere, because the evidence has actually proven that there actually were. At the time, many people within the party, as well as the general population of Russia, really did accept that these trials were actually genuine. The accused confessed at the trial, live, in front of all of the people who were there, and they were sentenced and executed the next day. It was a really effective way of dealing with the situation. Zinoviev, according to police gossip, when he was sent back to await his execution, became so hysterical when his executioner actually entered his cell that he panicked, the executioner panicked, and shot him in his cell. Now, this meant that he was shot out with the public view, which was better for Stalin because he couldn't open his mouth and yell things like Lenin's deathbed testament proclamation or anything like that. But it is unlikely that he became hysterical and had to be shot in his cell just as control. These executions were very significant because they were the first executions of people who had actually belonged to the Central Committee, not just the party in general. The second show trial took place in January 1937, in which Karol Radek, who was a known Trotskyite, was the main defendant. It didn't matter what he said, he was found guilty because he confessed, as he would have done after the NKVD was obviously at his trial and at his confession wielding point. The third and the last great show trial was staged in March 1938 and was possibly the most dramatic because it involved Bukharin. And Bukharin, being a great orator and public speaker, was not willing to sit back and take it the way that others had up to that point. He was able to make a much more spirited defence of his actions and gain a lot of publicity while he did so. Ultimately, however, it didn't matter. In the end, he, along with 20 other people, including old Bolsheviks like Rykov, for example, as well as the former head of the NKVD, Yagoda, confessed to everything they'd been sentenced to and were sentenced to execution or to the gulags as a result. Most of them were shot within a few hours of the trial ending. Bukharin and Rykov apparently going on record as cursing Stalin's name as they died. So the question becomes, if the evidence was not great and the confession was the legitimacy of the purges and the show trials, why would you confess? Some of these charges were quite frankly ludicrous. So things like plotting to assassinate Kirov, Stalin, even Lenin, espionage on behalf of foreign powers, conspiring with Trotsky and other Trotskyites, planning to restore capitalism, to overthrow socialism, basically things that were just a bit ridiculous but felt really scary and really real to the people that were tuning in via propaganda. The evidence that they used during the trials was clearly faked. Some of it didn't even stand up to scrutiny at all. One example of just how ridiculous these accusations actually were is that one of the main pieces of evidence was that they had testimony from hotels where the conspirators were supposed to have met. And this explained what the meeting was about and what they had said, and there was eyewitnesses that saw them there. Now, one of the examples of the hotels that the conspirators were actually supposed to have met at did not actually even exist at the time that the meeting was supposed to have happened. Also, there were things like one of the accused people was actually in prison when he was supposed to have committed an offence, which he would obviously not have then been able to do. So if the evidence was so shoddy and the level of kind of accusation was so ridiculous, why would the people actually confess to this? The most obvious answer is that they were worn down by the torture and interrogation of the NKVD. It's also clear that they agreed to confess as part of a deal that they were making where the families would also be spared. Now, this was true of Bukharin, who made the deal and actually wrote a letter to his wife, which historians have access to, which talks about the fact that he had confessed to his crimes so that the innocent within their family and friends could be spared. It's probably true of both Zinoviev and Kamenev as well. However, it didn't actually work out that way, because after they were killed or executed, as their sentence obviously gave permission to, the family members were unlikely to escape as well. They were seen as associates and quite often were sentenced to gulags or to prison as well. Basically, the show trials allowed for one by one Stalin's old friends to be rounded up and put on trial. Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, amongst many others, definitely suffered, tortured into confession for crimes they couldn't possibly have actually carried out. This picture here shows Stalin signing death warrants, and it was said that apparently he could spend up to 5 hours a day doing this during the height of the trials in 1937. The poster on the other side was from 1938, and it was targeted as Stalin's carnage. Basically, it shows you everyone who was part of Lenin's general staff in 1917, with the only person who was actually left alive from every single one of the people on this picture being Stalin alone. And the heading, "Stalin the Executioner Alone Remains," was a really key point of actually seeing which particular groups within the party and within society that Stalin was targeting. He was getting rid of the people who were around about him in the events of 1917, so that his events, him as the leader and him as the hero, could not be questioned, because those who were with him and those who were responsible for other developments within Russia were actually no longer there when the time came. So, a little bit of information then. Kirov's murder was basically just a pretext and a justification for the Great Terror over that 4-year period. It was seen as a conspiracy against the Soviet state and its leaders, and this played really quite nicely into Stalin's paranoia and into the manipulative excuse he needed to root out people he thought were enemies, people that needed to be gotten rid of. Have a look at page 258 to 261 in the textbook, and there is an activity box for you to complete there as well to just consolidate this information about the show trials. So pause the video, finish this task off, and then come back to the video when you're done. Part of the Great Purges as well that we've talked about is this idea of the Yezhovshchina. Just after the first Great Show trial had ended in September 1936, Nikolai Yezhov replaced Yagoda as the head of the secret police. Now, the reason for this is because Yagoda was criticised for not finding enemies of the state quickly enough. Very much a clear sign from Stalin that he wanted to advance the terror, regardless of what he said about the NKVD basically being responsible for the excesses of the terror. By replacing Yagoda, who Stalin had got on quite well with up to that certain point, he was very much showing that he wanted someone who was going to be slightly more ruthless. Yezhov pretty much initiated a period of terror, which is the term that we use on the title here, which ultimately reached its height in the mid 1937 period and did last until late into 1938. He was referred to as a bloodthirsty dwarf or the Iron Hedgehog, and according to sources and historians as well, he lacked any trace of conscience or moral principles. So you can have a look at a little bit more detail about why this was such an important part of the purges, and if you think about why this kind of links into the idea that it was about control and about exerting terror rather than about Stalin's personality, and you can have a look at that using the textbook to help you. So page 261 to 266, and complete the activity box that is shown there on 263. Ultimately, how many people were killed in the purges? It's difficult for us to calculate the exact number. The results of the census that were taken in January 1937 were suppressed, and the census organisers were shot, so we don't actually have an awful lot of primary evidence from the time. Also, the NKVD burned quite a lot of their archive when the Germans approached Moscow in 1941 to prevent it falling into their hands, so this meant they were unlikely to actually be able to give us any clear estimates for this. However, Robert Conquest, historian, has suggested that the estimates could be as high as these numbers here, with 7 to 8 million people being arrested during the period, 1 to 1.5 million being executed, 7 to 8 being put into the gulags, 2 million of those in the gulags dying, famine taking out another 70 million, and the death total during this period of purging from 1934 to 1938 being roughly about 20 million people. Now, figures like this are really good for historiography. Make sure that you're using the fact that it is Robert Conquest who is estimating it. You could talk about estimates by historians such as Robert Conquest, put the death total for the purges at approximately 20 million people, and use these statistics to help emphasise an argument that you're building or making. So the purges ultimately end in 1938 when Stalin calls a halt to them. Arrests slowed down, but people were actually still being purged well into 1939, despite this calling for an end. The purges really were destabilising Russian society. The administrative systems were falling apart, key personnel were missing, and it was having a negative impact on the industrial production, as we've already said. Stalin blamed Yezhov and the NKVD. He said that the excesses of terror were a result of them, not of anybody else. And yet, in 1940, a hitman on Stalin's order murdered Trotsky. So, by 1940, virtually all of the old Bolsheviks had been purged and wiped out, and Stalin felt more in control of the country and of the party itself. Ultimately, millions of people suffered in Stalin's purges. Workers, peasants, members of the Communist Party itself. It was a period of brutality, persecution, executions, forced labour. Millions of people died of overwork and starvation. The shops were empty. Clothing was dull and badly made because of the inability to get access to materials. Household items were difficult to find. And although the USSR was a communist state, the dictatorship of Stalin during this period is just as tight and just as complete, and in a lot of ways even more bloody and death toll worthy than that of Hitler, Mussolini or other leaders at this point in time in Europe. However, despite the appalling tragedies that actually existed in terms of human life and other things within the purges period, there were actually some positive aspects to Stalin's rule. So, for example, schools were built, social insurance schemes were introduced, and Russia did become a modern industrial country, to the extent that they do manage to surpass America being the country to put the first person into space. And if it hadn't been for the general kind of forcing of Stalin's hand in keeping control so no one could say no to him within the party, and also in forcing his ideology through, it is unlikely that Russia would have been in that position. So in some regards it was economically a success for Russia, but at such a high cost that it is almost morally reprehensible to use that as a positive. How the Great Terror has been interpreted by historians, as with everything, it has had vigorous debate. Historians do like to argue over the explanations of the Great Terror. Why did it happen? The entire process is not very clear. Very few documents were released under the Soviet regime, and certain key archives, like the KGB archives for example, are still not open today, so we have to take on board that while we're thinking about why some historians think one way and others think the other way. Quite a lot of the debate between historians centres around two things. One is the role of Stalin in the terror and the extent of his personal control over the process, whether or not he meant for everything to happen the way it did, and the other side is to what extent his actual personality shaped it. Was it actually rather that he was paranoid and he was just acting through this paranoia, rather than him having an entirely shaped control plan that he was trying to do? There's some really nice diagrams on page 268 of the textbook. I would really suggest you make a copy of these historiography diagrams to help you remember it for this topic, because really useful in an essay to introduce this kind of clear debate between the two schools of thought. So school of thought number one for this is the totalitarian view. Predominantly it was a Western view since the Second World War period, and it sees the purges as a top-down set of events. So instructions were given out from the top, aka by Stalin, and it was Stalin's intent to kill his opponent. It was intentionalist in every possible way. A key exponent of this, Robert Conquest, in his book The Great Terror, A Reassessment in 1990. Fantastic book, definitely worthwhile tracking down online or a digital copy. We do have a copy in the classroom, but obviously we can't access that just now. But a really nice way to kind of look at what the terror actually did. This is a view that's also shared by more liberal schools of thought, liberal historians, or ex-Soviet dissidents, such as Medvedev and others as well. They kind of differ over the level of responsibility, some of it going towards Lenin and that Stalin just continued on, others that Stalin had this complete plan of how he was going to get rid of opposition and use it to exert control in a complete dictatorship over the USSR. So that's the totalitarian view of things. The revisionist view comes into play from the kind of the 1970s onward, and they see it more as a decisionist sort of thing. The purges were not planned, but rather were a result of the decisions that had been made by the party leadership as a reaction to the circumstances the 1930s had brought. There was no way for Stalin and the party to know that these circumstances were going to happen. They just had to react. And as they reacted, it was kind of a domino effect. More and more things started to happen as well. One person reacts, another person reacts, another person, and you have to try and contain that. And that's what Stalin pretty much did. Getty, another good historian in The Origins of the Great Purges, which was written in 1985, he kind of says that this takes a lot of the responsibility away from Stalin. He sees Stalin alone as a simple and convenient interpretation of how these events happened. So blaming Stalin is just really easy to do. He criticises the Western historians for relying upon memoirs of the people who left the USSR and argues that they are going to be biased with Stalin as this kind of big bad that they were running from and that is responsible for all these awful things, because that's the coloured view that they actually had. Rather than that, it is actually more likely to be reactions that are happening within Russia, and that Stalin is only more or less just going from one point to the next, reacting as he goes. This is kind of filled in with Sheila Fitzpatrick's, as we've already seen, with her idea that the purges came from below, and there's others such as Graham Gill, Roberta Manning, other revisionist historians that share this particular view. So when we think about the causes of the purges, we've talked about quite a lot of these. One of the things that we've not talked about is Stalin's paranoia in any kind of real detail in his sort of private life and personality. There is a lot of the paranoia, a lot of stock given to this paranoia of Stalin. Some of it also goes towards the idea that he was grieving at the suicide of his wife in 1932, and then the murder of Kirov just kicked that all off again. There's a lot of people that go for the idea of his background and how ruthless his life had been growing up, and that this was him just reacting to how things were because that was the only way he knew how. In terms of the role actually played by Stalin, the vast majority of historians believe that it was, at least in some way, because of Stalin's personality that the purges had the level of intensity that they actually did. The driving force behind the Great Terror was Stalin, because he was at the centre of the decision-making process. So whether it was his fault or it was the decisionist view, ultimately Stalin is the one making those decisions. Stalin was deeply suspicious of others and was verging on paranoia within the suspicion. He was very distrustful, and he thought that many of those around him were enemies and spies. The suicide of his wife made him even more convinced that those around him would betray him, because he saw her suicide as a betrayal, and he wanted basically to get them before they got him. He was a very vindictive personality, he was very vengeful, and he was one to bear grudges, definitely in every aspect of his life, so why would his political life be any different? He liked to take revenge on the people that he had seen as getting one up on him or thwarting him in some way in the past. He was crude, he was brutal, and he had a fascination with violence, according to quite a lot of sources. So when he was pushed, he would resort to violence as a solution to his problems. He was known to kind of be quite intimidating as a personality and for flying off the handle. He saw himself as the hero of the revolution, who alone could take Russia forward and transform the country, and those who refused to accept this vision of events were traitors. And a lot of historians like Alan Bullock and Robert Tucker would agree with this view, that Stalin's role, not just the paranoia, but his whole being, his whole personality, was the main reason for the purges, and it was because of this that he actually did what he did. In terms of his motives, he felt threatened by the growing opposition to him in the early 1920s. He reacted to this by eliminating all possible rivals so that no one could form an alternative government to him. He was determined to be in a position of absolute power, and he wanted to bring the party under his total control so that they would carry out his policies without question. By keeping the party in a constant state of insecurity, who would be denounced, who would be arrested next, was Stalin's way of keeping control. He wanted control of the people, and the purges crushed his opposition and any critics, which meant that everyone else would fall in line for him. By the late 1930s, he was convinced that there was a good chance of war on the horizon, so he wanted to remove anybody who might oppose a foreign policy that he would put in place to counteract this idea of war. He also didn't want to allow anybody to slow down the pace of industrialisation, because the Soviet Union would need the weapons and armaments to fight the war. It was almost as if he was so focused on getting the materials that they needed for the war, maybe because that had been such a big problem during the First World War, and even the reasons for the successes of the Civil War was because of the Aladdin's cave element, being able to access all these goods and materials, that he was convinced that that's what Russia needed to win a war in Europe. So he was actually willing to sacrifice the expertise of the military and the men of the military, as long as whoever was left was well supplied. War is expensive. He knows that the economy is only starting to start to level out, so he has to make sure that industrially Russia can survive. There's no point in being a leader of a country that is not going to survive a conflict that you're going to become involved in. Stalin genuinely thought he was acting in the interests of the party and the revolution, and he thought that his removal or the reversal of any policies he put in place would be disastrous for the Soviet Union, and it would fall apart. So in terms of how far he was responsible for the Great Terror, textbook wise, we're going to look at section F of the textbook, and there's a couple of activities for you to do there, one on page 269 and the other on 275. So pause the video there, go do these tasks and come back when you've finished. Other reasons for the purges could be the problems within the party itself. The Central Party in Moscow was having problems controlling the party in the regions. That was not new. It had happened during Tsar Nicholas's time, it had happened during the Provisional Government's time, and it had happened during Lenin's time. Edicts from the Central Party sometimes conflicted with local demands, and the local party did not want to go about finding these kulaks because there were valuable men within that community. This meant they just ignored the edicts that were coming in, and it undermined Stalin's authority. In industrial towns, local party bosses wanted to reach their production targets, so they don't want to purge the specialists, and in order to stop this, the Central Party had to use some form of force to show that they were actually not willing to be messed with or ignored. The show trials were used for this, to create an atmosphere of fear and ensure that no matter what they ordered, their orders would be carried out, because if not, this was the consequence. They also encouraged the lower levels of the party to criticise those that were higher up, as we've said, which meant there was never going to be an example where the show trials couldn't be rolled out as a stick to beat the people with. If you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. It led to a mass rush of accusations which got out of control, but did develop this momentum of fear that Stalin and the party needed. In terms of economic difficulties, in the mid-1930s the production figures are levelling off, and the 5-year plans are falling behind schedule. There's a downturn in the Soviet economy and a really bad harvest that year, so Stalin needs to find scapegoats amongst the managers and the workers for these economic difficulties. He also wants to ensure loyalty from the managers by encouraging criticism from below, and the workers are only too happy to identify managers and officials as the cause of their problems, because if it's not the managers, then it's them. And they don't want to be accused of it, so they're going to blame the ones above them. This is tied in with other movements where workers were told to put pressure on their managers by demanding tools and machinery to increase their production, and the managers who didn't respond were treated as saboteurs and were gotten rid of as a result. This meant that if the economic goals that Stalin had said that they were on target for didn't materialise, he could shoulder the blame off of him onto someone else and say, well, though I did say this, it's not my fault. I thought it would happen. It hasn't happened, not because of me or because my targets were unrealistic. It's because these saboteurs are responsible. And it meant that he could keep control again of the country through using the economic difficulties as a scapegoat solution. In terms of the social instability, the disruption that the 5-year plans and collectivisation had caused had created a really unstable society. Mass urbanisation had created social tension and violence because the cities were overcrowded and the countryside lacked basic facilities and services. There was a lot of hostility towards the Communist Party and the government because of this idea, and they were really worried about a loss of control of what they referred to as a quicksand society, where they were sinking quite quickly as a result of this social instability. Now remember, these people in Russia have revolution under their belt. They know what that looks like. They are likely to do that again if they think their government is not actually willing to help them. So this would kind of be an indication that Stalin did the purges in order to stifle the criticisms of the leadership and to control the people and keep them working to try and meet as much of these targets as possible. There's also the position of the NKVD. Some would argue that the NKVD conducted the purges with such a level of vigour because they were in the interests of the NKVD as an institution. In order for them to be taken seriously, they needed to be a force to be reckoned with. Within the NKVD itself, there were divisions and power struggles. Some units operated their own factions and they used the purges to their own advantage. They got rid of people from the other factions, or etc. and so on. There may also have been a view that any slowdown after the rigours of enforced collectivisation and the 5-year plan might make the NKVD look weak and people would take advantage of this. But the purges would raise their profile and allow them to become the leading institution in the Soviet system. And this is where Stalin's idea of the NKVD did this in excess comes into play. So the reasons for the purges is not so much about necessarily the government's control and Stalin's control, but rather the NKVD, the instrument of control, making sure that people took them seriously. We've also got the gulags. It's the labour camp. We need labour to actually work in it. They did the dangerous jobs like logging, gold mining in these inhospitable regions. Stalin needs money. He needs money that these industries are earning to actually export and import goods so that he could buy in the Western technology they needed to increase the pace of industrialisation and increase the pace that they could create the military goods he needed for war. So the purges were a way of filling the gulags and making a slave labour force who were going to carry out these dangerous working conditions, dangerous jobs, in order for Stalin to get money to increase industrialisation. There's also the element of external threats being responsible for the purges. The prospect of war looked increasingly likely after Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. He's very anti-communist, so this gives the USSR an idea that it would be them targeted first. This increased the pressure to develop an armaments industry based on the heavy industry, which all had to be in place. So therefore, and very unwilling people already suffering from the impact of the first 5-year plan, had to be pushed to even greater efforts to meet this demand. In that respect, we can argue that actually the purges were a mechanism to fight against external threats, or to the threat of war, to fight against the threat of war. It was a spur to Stalin to purge the opposition who might interfere with his war plans, but the external threats were the reason that he did this, to ensure that the USSR would win any sort of fight against Germany when it came. So, in summary, there was a difference between the earlier purges, which were non-violent, and the purges and show trials, which used terror against the party. Terror had been a constant feature of the Stalinist regime right from its very beginning, but there is marked opposition before 1934 and the 17th Party Congress, which Stalin then uses as his catalyst, really, to try and start purging. The murder of Kirov triggered the Great Terror into more kind of high overdrive. Old Bolsheviks from both the left and right wings of the party were deposed on a series of show trials. The party was purged from above and below, where members were encouraged to criticise and renounce others. Mass terror engulfed other sections of the population who represented the bulk of those who were being repressed by the NKVD. Their order 00447 led to a campaign of social cleansing where millions died or were imprisoned or deported in a class warfare aspect. Terror was used to deal with the instability that was caused by the quicksand society and resolve the difficulties caused by impossibly high economic targets, which were explained away as sabotage. At the end of the process, Stalin emerged as dictator of the USSR with supreme control of a party that had been moulded by him and a populace that was in the main subservient to the leader and to the party, aka to Stalin. So, in terms of our essay to consolidate our learning in this, we're going to work on this question. How valid is the view that Stalin implemented the purges out of a desire to control the Communist Party? And what I want you to do is think about the reasons for the purges. Okay, there is a lot of evidence that supports the view that Stalin implemented the purges out of a desire to control the Communist Party, and a lot of them were political reasons that he did this. But there are other reasons that we can actually use that show that it wasn't just about a desire to control the Communist Party, but rather about a wider desire to control the country in general. So we've got control as one, political reasons as one, and other factors that we can actually use are things like social factors, economic factors, and Stalin's personality as well. All of these things are reasons behind the purges, and these are things that we'll be talking about as factors in this essay. So this slide just gives you a wee bit of information about the political bit, so evidence that supports the view that Stalin implemented the purges out of a desire to control the Communist Party. And there's a couple of points here which I'll not read through. You can have a look at, you can pause the video, or I'll put just this section of the PowerPoint up as well that you can use. Again, still in the political aspect here, that's more political reasons. But evidence that doesn't support this view and says it's wider than this would be the social factors here. And again, I won't read through it, but you can pause it and have a wee read, or you can have a look at the PowerPoint version. Economic factors as well. And then Stalin's personality. Historians, as we've kind of already seen, we've got Fitzpatrick and Tucker, who we've mentioned, as well as Gill and Service, and what their views are there. You can use this to help you, or you can look at other historians we've mentioned so far in the lesson, or have a look at the textbook or other books as well. Do some research and see what you can come up with. Remember, for your introduction, you really need to put the essay into some context to address the question, give an overview of what historians are saying, give what issues are being talked about by them, and who agrees and who disagrees. Identify what factors or key issues you're going to be talking about, and then introduce what your ultimate conclusion is going to be, your line of argument. Do you agree with the statement? Do you not agree? And even just give a little bit of a view, maybe why you might think that. You can use this model if you want to. You can shorten it, use parts of it, or write it yourself, but this could be the introduction that you use for your essay. If you want to pause the video and use that, that's fine, but it'll also be on the PowerPoint version in the team. In terms of your main sections, make sure you're discussing at least 3 factors. Make sure that you've got a really key factor sentence, remember, which makes it clear what your line of argument might be. So the main reason for this is a less important reason, a least important reason. Give it a really clear line of argument sentence. Then you introduce your evidence, your KU, describe the factor under discussion, talk about it, and analyse your evidence throughout. Explain why it's relevant, explain how it links into your question, introduce your historical debate about the factor, argue back and forward. Does it link in with your analysis plus? Do they agree with one another? Which one do you agree with? And then introduce your overall evaluation at the end. Make sure that this links to the question. It is helping you answer the question. It's like a mini sort of sub-conclusion, but it is not going to be repeating your analysis. It needs to be a new piece of evidence, and it needs to be fairly detailed. In terms of your conclusions, make sure that when you're writing a good conclusion, you are actually summarising the main points of your discussion. You are using your evaluation points at the end of your paragraphs to summarise each section, and you're coming to a very clear, definitive answer about the question that you're being asked, not the question you want it to be. Make sure it supports your line of argument in your introduction. If it doesn't, you need to go back and change one of them. You should not be making a different argument by the time you get to your conclusion as what you've put in your introduction. The two things have to be the same. Give evidence to support your judgment. Make sure that it's really, really clear that you're answering the question, and maybe what to do is a good idea. You can use the next 2 slides. There's a template for conclusions to help you, but it might be a good idea to write your introduction and your conclusion first, and then go back and write your essay and use these as 2 framework pieces. So this is a good way to start your introduction. Again, I won't read through this. You can have a pause and have a read of it, or you can use the one that's on the team, and then end it with your overall structure like this. So that's your task for the week. The assignment task will be up in the tab. Any questions or things you have, feel free to message in the team or email and let me know how you're getting on.